For 3 hours, from noon until 3 in the afternoon, an unnatural darkness has settled over Golgotha. The crowd that had gathered to watch the execution had gone quiet, uneasy, unsure what to make of a midday sky gone black. And then, breaking through that silence, a voice cried out, in Aramaic, in words so raw that two separate gospel writers chose to preserve the actual sound of them rather than smooth them into Greek. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? If you have sat with this verse for any length of time, it should trouble you. Christians confess that the man hanging on that cross was and is God the Son, one in essence with the Father, one in essence with the Spirit. So what does it mean for God to cry out to God, asking why he has been abandoned? Is this despair breaking through? Is it something else entirely? A sentence loaded with more theological weight than almost any other 4 words in the Bible? That is what we are going to sit with today. Not to explain the pain away, to actually understand what Jesus was doing when he prayed those words on the cross and what they mean for anyone who has ever felt forsaken by God themselves. This cry is preserved in 2 of the 4 Gospels, Mark 15:34 and Matthew 27:46, both recorded word for word in transliterated Aramaic before translating it for their Greek-speaking readers. That choice matters. Gospel writers routinely translated Aramaic and Hebrew terms for their audience. When they instead preserve the original sound of a phrase, most scholars take it as a sign that this saying was too central, too well remembered in the earliest Christian communities to be smoothed over. Mark's gospel is widely considered the earliest written account, and scholars point to sayings like this one as belonging to the most primitive layer of the tradition, a saying so difficult that the early church would have had every reason to soften or omit it, and instead preserved it exactly. The setting matters as much as the wording. By the time Jesus speaks these words, he has already endured a night of arrest and interrogation before the Sanhedrin, a formal trial before Pilate, a Roman scourging and public mockery from soldiers, religious leaders, and bystanders alike, some of them quoting his own claims back at him. He saved others. Himself, he cannot save. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross. He is hung on the cross since roughly 9 in the morning, flanked by 2 convicted criminals, a placard nailed above his head reading King of the Jews. Now, at the 6th hour, darkness falls over the whole land, lasting until the 9th hour, noon until 3. It is into that darkness, at the very end of it, that this cry breaks out. There is one more detail worth knowing. The 9th hour was, in Jerusalem, the hour of the evening Tamid sacrifice, the daily lamb offered at the temple as the sun began its descent. To a first-century Jewish audience, a lamb dying at the exact hour the temple lamb was dying was not a coincidence easily missed. And crucially, in the mouth of a first-century Jewish teacher, my God, why have you forsaken me, is not a spontaneous sentence. It is a quotation, the opening line of Psalm 22, a psalm every observant Jew in that crowd would have known by heart. Understanding what Jesus is doing here means understanding what that psalm actually says and how it was meant to be heard. So let's start with the literal textual layer. What is actually happening when Jesus says these words? Psalm 22 opens in Hebrew, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Jesus' Aramaic version shifts the phrasing slightly, as would be natural for an Aramaic-speaking teacher quoting a Hebrew text he knew from the synagogue, but the reference is unmistakable. And here is something crucial that gets lost in a modern reading. In first century Jewish practice, quoting the opening line of a psalm was a common way of invoking the entire psalm. Ancient audiences didn't read psalms as isolated verses the way we scroll a single quote today. A trained listener hearing the first line was meant to recall the psalm's whole arc, beginning, middle, and end, the way naming the first line of a well-known hymn calls the whole hymn to mind. And Psalm 22 has a very specific arc. It opens in raw, unrelieved lament. Why have you forsaken me? I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. The middle section describes suffering in language that reads, to later Christian readers, almost like a description of crucifixion written centuries before Rome invented the practice. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. But the psalm does not end there. It turns. By its final third, the same voice that opened in abandonment is declaring, He has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before him. The psalm that begins in Forsakenness ends in worldwide praise. Historians differ on how much of that ending Jesus himself meant to invoke in the moment. Some read the cry as pure, unresolved anguish, full stop, and caution against reading later Christian hope back into it. The majority, Christian reading, ancient and modern, holds that a first century Jewish teacher quoting a psalm's opening line would have known and intended to gesture toward where that psalm goes. Both readings agree on this much. The words are a real, personal, doubled address. My God, not a theological statement recited for the crowd's benefit. Notice, too, how it lands on those standing nearby. Some among the crowd mishear Eloi as a call to Elijah and wait to see if the prophet will come rescue him. They miss the psalm entirely. Even in this moment of quotation, Jesus is misunderstood, heightening rather than softening the isolation of the scene. It's worth adding that this kind of quotation was not unusual practice in the ancient world. Naming the opening line of a well-known text to summon its whole meaning shows up across rabbinic literature of the period. Much the way naming the first line of a well-loved hymn today calls the entire hymn to mind for a congregation without anyone singing a second word of it. Later, Jewish tradition itself, the Aramaic Targum on the Psalms, already reads Psalm 22 in messianic terms, which tells us this text was already carrying that kind of theological weight independent of the Gospels. Jesus was not inventing a connection between his suffering and this psalm. He was stepping into a reading that already existed and living it out in his own body. Now, what does the tradition do with this? This is where the church has read carefully for 2,000 years, because a careless reading here can slide into real heresy in either direction. The earliest and most careful readers, Athanasius and later Cyril of Alexandria, Augustine, and Aquinas, insisted on a crucial distinction rooted in the doctrine of who Christ is. Christ is one person with two natures, fully divine and fully human, joined, as the Council of Chalcedon would later define it in the year 451, without confusion without change, without division, without separation. The divine nature cannot suffer, cannot be abandoned, cannot be separated from the Father. The Trinity itself is never broken, not for one instant, not even here. That doctrinal precision rules out two opposite errors. One, that the Father himself suffered on the cross, a view the early church condemned as patripassionism. And two, that Christ is really two separate subjects, a divine one safely untouched and a human one merely borrowed, a view condemned as Nestorianism. Orthodox Christology insists on something harder to hold in the mind. One person genuinely experiencing abandonment in his full humanity while remaining in his divine nature, eternally one with the Father. Augustine adds something else that changes how the whole verse should be heard. He argues Christ is speaking here as what Augustine calls the totus Christus, the whole Christ, head and body together. That is, on the cross, Christ takes onto his own lips the cry of every person who has ever felt cut off from God, speaking as humanity's representative rather than narrating his private emotional state. And Augustine is insistent on one more point, because this is a quotation of Psalm 22, and because that psalm resolves in vindication and praise, the cry itself is already secretly an act of hope. Jesus is not just voicing despair. In Augustine's reading, he is proclaiming in code that any Jewish listener could have decoded that vindication is coming. Aquinas presses even further into a question that occupied medieval theologians for centuries. Did Christ's human soul, even while his body suffered and while he prayed this cry, retain the beatific vision, the direct, unbroken sight of the Father that Aquinas believed Christ possessed throughout his earthly life? Aquinas' own answer was yes. In the deepest part of his soul, Christ's vision of the Father was never interrupted, even as the rest of his human experience. His senses, his emotions, his lower faculties underwent genuine abandonment and anguish. It's a difficult distinction to hold, but it is trying to protect the same truth from two directions at once. That the suffering was completely real, and that the union between the Son and the Father was never, for a single moment, actually severed. The Reformers read this same moment and heard something even heavier. Luther, and especially Calvin, resisted any reading that made this cry primarily symbolic or representative. In his Institutes, Calvin ties this moment directly to the line in the Apostles' Creed, confessing that Christ descended into hell, not for Calvin, a geographic descent after death, but this very moment on the cross, when Christ underwent what Calvin calls the horrors of a condemned and forsaken man. In this reading, the cry is not Jesus quoting a psalm at arm's length. It is Jesus in his full humanity, genuinely undergoing the estrangement from God that sin itself produces, so that no one who trusts in him would ever have to undergo it in the same way themselves. This is the logic later theology calls penal substitution. Christ takes the penalty in the sinner's place, including its full relational cost. Notice the two readings don't actually contradict each other so much as press on different facets of the same jewel. Augustine's totus Christus and Calvin's penal weight can both be true at once. Christ speaks as our representative, and what he represents is real, substitutionary abandonment, born so it need not be permanently borne by us. 20th century theologians push this further still. Barth argues that in this cry, God in Christ enters into solidarity with human God-forsakenness itself, not from a safe distance, but from the inside. Jürgen Moltmann, writing after the horrors of the 20th century, goes further in his book, The Crucified God, arguing that the cross means God is not a distant, unmoved observer of suffering, but takes suffering into God's own life, so that there is no human abandonment so deep that God has not already entered it first. Eastern Orthodox readers tend to approach the same moment with more restraint, resisting Western theology's tendency to systematize exactly what happened inside the relationship between Father and Son at that instant. Orthodox theology speaks instead of kenosis, Christ's self-emptying, described in Philippians chapter 2, and prefers apophatic silence at the edge of the mystery rather than a fully worked out mechanism. What Western and Eastern readers share across all these centuries and disagreements is the refusal to let this verse mean either too little, mere theater, or too much, an actual rupture within God himself. So how does someone actually live with this? Not as a doctrine to affirm, but as something to carry. Here is the practical layer that flows directly from what we've just seen. The cry of dereliction gives permission. If the Son of God, in the depth of his suffering, prayed a psalm of raw, unresolved lament, rather than reciting something composed and triumphant, then lament itself is a legitimate form of faith, not a failure of it. Roughly a third of the Psalter consists of exactly this kind of lament, complaint, confusion, even accusation addressed honestly to God. Christian spiritual writers going back centuries and later figures like John of the Cross, writing on the dark night of the soul, describe seasons where God feels entirely absent to the one praying, where faith persists with no felt comfort at all. The cross tells such a person, you are not outside the faith when you feel this. You may be standing exactly where Jesus stood. This is why many church traditions keep Good Friday services stripped of comfort. No triumphant music, often no benediction, sometimes ending in silence rather than a blessing. The liturgy refuses to rush past the forsakenness toward Easter morning too quickly, because the forsakenness has to be allowed its full weight first. Chaplains who sit with the dying and counselors who sit with the grieving often return to this exact verse for the same reason, not to offer an explanation that resolves the pain, but to offer companionship inside it. Someone keeping vigil at a hospital bed, unable to feel God's presence at all, is not failing at prayer. They are, whether they know the reference or not, praying Psalm 22 exactly as it opens, in confidence that opening a psalm is not the same as ending one. So we come back to where we started. How can God cry out to God, asking why he has been forsaken? The layered answer is that this cry is genuinely, fully both things at once. A real cry of human abandonment, spoken by God the Son in his true humanity, and simultaneously the deliberate invocation of a psalm, whose ending has not yet been spoken aloud, but is already quietly guaranteed. Golgotha sits at the hinge point of Psalm 22 after the opening cry, before the closing praise. Holy Saturday, the silent day between cross and resurrection, is the church living inside that same hinge, refusing to rush from lament to triumph before its time. That is why this single verse has held the attention of Athanasius, defending it against heresy, Augustine reading it as the whole Christ's voice, Calvin hearing in it the full weight of substitution, and Moltmann finding in it God's solidarity with every abandoned person in history. None of them treat it as a problem to be explained away. All of them treat it as the place where the depth of the incarnation is most exposed. God, in Christ, going all the way down into the one experience that seems most incompatible with being God at all. So here's a question worth sitting with. Long after this video ends, the next time you feel forsaken by God, truly not performing it, but actually, is it possible you are standing in the exact same place Jesus stood, not outside Psalm 22, but inside it, mid-Psalm, before the ending has arrived? What would it mean to keep praying anyway, trusting an ending you cannot yet feel?